So, welcome everybody. My name is Michelle Seddon, and I am a ranger at the James A. Garfield National Historic Site. Want to give you a little background as to why I chose this topic, petticoat espionage. I recently, about 7 months ago, transferred up from Virginia. I was a state ranger there at a historic site, and I also worked at some historic homes and some plantation homes around there. What I found, and I was working on, believe it or not, my undergraduate project, and it was my thesis, and I was literally in the area of Northern Virginia that was just inundated with these Southern stories of these women that nobody really talked about. And in fact, one of the homes that I worked at was connected to Mosby's Rangers. They had two of the sons there, but they had also talked about some of the Southern women that were spies, and they really had these great stories, and we were digging through personal, their diaries and everything, and all of these stories came up of, you could see where Southern women, how they were prior to the war, what their expectations were, and what happened during the war, and then how that completely altered at the end of the war. So that's what I'm really going to focus on here. Like I said, it's petticoat espionage, the transformation of the Southern belle in the American Civil War. All right, so Southern women during the Civil War, they were the hostess, the caretaker, the rebel, the spy. So during the 1800s, Southern women would define not only a class structure, but a certain ideology that would face a complete transformation in the wake of the war. Now, the role of the Southern lady really needs to be classified, or that class structure. So ladies in the South believed in the Southern way of life. Plantation life, the life of leisure, was not only the norm, it was to be expected. Southern women of the higher echelon did not work or toil in the fields. They were reared at a very young age in proper etiquette, how to manage a home, educated in the languages and art and music. Their main lot in life really was to marry well. And that was pretty much pushed on them from a very young age. They were told they had to carry on the line with children, carry on that family name, support not only the spouse, but they had to support what they considered the Southern cause. The Southern cause, and it still is prevalent in a couple of places in the South now. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with it. It's that lost cause narrative. And what that was is it was ingrained in their lives, started very early on, and even throughout the war, even well into 1900s, that lost cause narrative was still being portrayed or pushed on your Southern women especially. They were the ones that promoted it. So to get into that lost cause narrative, in case people aren't aware of exactly what that was, so prior to and throughout the Civil War, Southern citizens, especially the women, believed that the lost cause narrative defined the people of the South, with it becoming a form of ideology for those who supported the Confederacy. The lost cause narrative promoted the concept that slavery did not cause the war, that secession was the right of the South and should be universally accepted, that Robert E. Lee personified the ideal Southern gentleman. Southern succession was not only accepted as a Christian right, but it was accepted by God and ordained by God. God bless you. Because of the aggression of the northern states. The enslaved, this is the one that always gets me, the enslaved working within the plantations and the farms were thankful for their lot in life. Believe it or not, this is what they believed. They believed that they were better off working the plantations than they did in their native lands. And that was part of what their cause that went with it. And finally, the North only won because more money and industry that was readily available within that region and was not available in your Southern regions. So basically, they were kind of classifying why exactly the war happened, why they lost, and with the idea that they were going to try to come back and the South was going to rise again. And this did go on well into your early 1900s with that thought process. So everyone here knows the whole "gotta be with Tara," "Gone with the Wind." There is literally a social structure that we now believe that some historians are thinking about. So we call it the welcome to Tara. Is it real or is it myth? And with that, modern day interpretation often leads towards this frail, pampered Southern woman of the Civil War because of this misguided, what we call the anthem of the Southern lady as seen in Gone with the Wind and other war movies. The self-involved Southern belle portrayed in literature and entertainment became a romanticized version of the women of the South during the American Civil War. Some historians would later on refer to this as the Scarlett O'Hara syndrome. Romanticizing the dynamics of the Southern belle became the harbinger to an erroneous interpretation of Southern women and their actions during the American Civil War. Prior to the American Civil War, early perception of Southern women leaned heavily on a society that was referred to as they were the quintessential Victorian womanhood, and that was how they were raised. Now, there is that Scarlett O'Hara syndrome. Believe it or not, it is real. It is still seen today, and there is literally a clinical explanation for it. It is often referred to as a histrionic personality disorder, or the pattern of many times unhealthy inner experiences and behaviors portrayed as exciting, motivating, and empowering, which later leads to distress and can affect one's social and professional development. This is where people will actually live off of drama, and that's where they get that Scarlett O'Hara syndrome from. This portrayal of a fictional character really did resonate even today on how many perceive the role of the Southern belle. While Scarlett O'Hara was a fictional character, the story behind her character used factual events with the mixture of societal elements of the period to show the typical Southern belle who struggled to maintain her status as an elite woman of society, even as what they would say their country or her country burned to the ground around her. This work of fiction ultimately gave the modern interpretation of the genteel Southern woman who was pampered, spoiled, and fickle. The self-involved women of the book or the movie could have been used as an anthem for Southern women throughout the 1800s, yet this interpretation only covered a very small portion of the vast dynamics that defined the women of the South during this American conflict. This false narrative that is often apparent in the historic record or early historic record is now being altered to include those who transformed the societal expectations of the day and used many or any means necessary for a Confederate victory. Romanticism of the Southern belle is now being replaced by this interpretation of these strong, independent, extremely resourceful, even very manipulative female characteristics, because at that time it was honor the South by any means. So if we're going to be looking at your female dynamics of your Southern or antebellum South, antebellum South is considered, depending, some will say it's right after the War of 1812 up until the onset of the Civil War. For this, I'm going from about 1813 up until about 1860. Pre-war defined the Southern women with very strict expectations and social edicts as well as class structure. What was expected from the upper class elite would not be the same for your working or lower class families, yet this would alter in the wake of the American Civil War, as women from both sides of the spectrum, North and South, found themselves and new family roles that many were not prepared for. Historian Mary Fahey would note that, quote, married women in the antebellum period had few to no individual rights. Unmarried had a lot less, if any at all. The elite had more freedom that the lower class yet remained both of them yet remained under patriarch rule. And what that meant was, regardless of if you were wealthy or if you were poor, if you were working the farm or if you were sitting around, drinking your mint julep, you still had to listen to and follow what the male dominant figure was in your family. Be that your father, your husband, your brother, it always went to that patriarch that was the leader or set the stage for what you were allowed to do. It was very rare to find any independence in early antebellum America. The extremely wealthy would fall under the same restrictions as those of the less economic means. Rural living confined many to a small society of peers that were often separated from those in your urban settings. Prior to the war, you would see And you can see, like many, if you will see many on from movies, it's kind of portrays it relatively simple, but those who stayed on the farm or lived in the farm did not socialize with those that were of your upper wealth. It just was not done. It was frowned upon. That changes during the war and after the war. Rural living confined many to a very small society of peers that were often separated, like I said, from your urban settings. The city allowed for social gatherings and fellowship of the elite. Wealthy women often benefited from education, while your poor were rarely ever educated, and their life, and the only thing they ever knew was that what they had on the farm. Be it the life of the wealth or excess, or one of work and poverty, women within the Southern culture still maintained a rigid understanding of the social edicts of the period. Both the wealthy and poorer women of antebellum South would take on new roles during wartime, often seeking any means necessary to support their families. Why all the fuss? As I said, when I was in Virginia, living in Virginia, I was inundated and surrounded by all of these wonderful, unbelievably strong stories of these strong women that had completely altered their life, not by that they wanted to. They had no choice. You saw it in the North, but it did not affect it as much as you see it in the South. And frankly, that's because the war didn't go up to the North. You only had a couple of battles that even came in a relatively fair, distance of them. The Southern area, or your Southern states, literally had the war on their front yard, in their house. Their entire infrastructure was decimated. So women had no choice but to learn an entire new way of life. So the neglect and horrors of the Civil War greatly impacted those in the South, especially the women and children that found themselves in the line of fire, with the battles being fought in their yards, their fields, or some even faced the confiscation of their homes as hospitals and military headquarters. Complete destruction of the homes, towns, and cities would have eventually a trickle-down effect, leading to food shortages, destruction of your infrastructure, and what was considered extreme poverty. Wonderful author Nancy Walker, she's also a historian, would state that the carefree Belle suffered from food shortages, restive slaves, and fear of the Yankee attack. Groups of these women would later go on to protest high food prices, offered shelter to the wounded soldiers. They tried not to offer shelter to the wounded Union soldiers. They usually did that because they had no choice. Manage complex households without the aid of a dominant male figure, with dwindling resources and limited access to goods. So to put that into perspective, you're looking at women who, some of them never had even turned a page of a book by themselves. And they now were being forced to learn how to cook and learn how to take care of the farm and learn how to take care of their home, learn how to take care of the fields. So this was very rapid. It was not something that was a long progression. It literally happened within about 5-year period. So they had to make their means or do whatever they could as quickly as possible. Northern women would not be directly faced with these hardships of war because, as I said earlier, those vast majority of the battles would not find root in your northern soil. While they did face the shortage of food and surplus goods, they had an easier access, these are your northern women, due to naval ports, railroads, and open transit systems that were not being destroyed by the battlefield. The loss of loved ones and the sacrifice of managing a home on their own seems to be the universal connection that Southern and Northern women had during this period. So a couple of quotes that I found really kind of put things into perspective. Historian Michael Varhala wrote this fantastic book about everyday life during the Civil War. And he has one thing where he says, prior to the war, balls were held by the upper crust. Later, war shortages would change the nature of social activities, yet Southern women still found a way to enjoy themselves. And then also another historian that I found really intriguing, she did an entire gender study about the gender studies and how the women had altered their persona, North and South. She really focused a lot on the Southern women, and she states that games, reading, and music were enjoyed by the wealthier sector of the Southern population, with women still acting as hostess to the assembly. Like chosen dancers in a waltz, moving with the purpose and gain, a Southern woman's lot in life was predefined or ordained by the expectations of society. Even those first few years of the Civil War, you saw Southern women who still were trying to maintain or hold a grasp on that way of life that they just didn't want to get rid of. But they also loved seeing when the soldiers came through their town. It gave them a choice or a chance to kind of hang out with the young men. I chose this quote because Amanda T. Edmonds, she is a remarkable young woman, and her diary was found. This was the site that I used to be a state ranger at. Her cousins were Mosby's Rangers. She lived right next to right there in Northern Virginia, having continuous troops marching through. And you could literally see the progression. She wrote it over about a 10-year period. You could see a progression of a very young 17, 18-year-old. And then later on in life, how her entire persona completely changed just by reading her diary. She first goes off and she talks about how she's really put off that the Northern troops are making so much noise as she's trying to sit underneath her pear tree and read her books. She didn't like how they were, making the uppity slaves. She really kind of stood with this for a very long time and stayed with this. But then you later on, about going into that last year of the war, you see her where her slaves have been sold off. She now is struggling. She doesn't know how they're going to eat. They're hiding in the basement as troops are coming through. So you see that progression of life just within her writings of that. So that's why but she was still a devoted rebel. She fought and died. She would constantly, all of her letters would say, I am in the Society of Rebels, and she was very proud of that fact. She goes on in 1863, she has this diary entry. It says, I have become completely devoted to the Society of Rebels. Why should I not love them for their heroic valor, fortitude, and very pleasant and agreeable fine company? She loved being in the company of the soldiers. So we're going to go a little bit about that war and the changing tide. I talked a little bit about how you saw women that were supporting that lost cause narrative. This kind of feeds into that a little bit. So women across the South rejoiced in the succession from the North and showed their support for the Confederacy in varied ways. Across the South, new roles of women leaned towards taking care of their families, as well as husbands, sons, and brothers as they went off to war. They really were proud of the fact that they were sending their loved ones off to do battle, and they often were would write extensively about how proud they were of seeing them go off. Of these elite white women were provided the opportunities to take place in the public spheres, voice their opinions, and fill the roles that were previously only held by men. The poorer white women faced the economic hardship and the demand to keep their families and farms functioning. So you got to remember that even though that you had your plantations that were being decimated, and they still had slaves, this was prior to the slaves being emancipated, you had that separation. So all the women that were on these plantations were facing was the fact that they didn't have men to run the plantations. So they basically had to learn how to delegate that. Your women that worked on these southern farms, they were thrown into basically we said that they were thrown into hell. They had no idea how to work a farm. They had to maintain the children. They had to see that the children were fed. They suffered the brunt of that complete change with it. So Arthur Michael Varla wrote in one of his writings, he says in 1861, Southerners of all society had a variety of reasons for linking their fates to the Confederacy. Relatively small, rich, very powerful landed aristocracy saw their wealthy lifestyle and other interests threatened. Early on, Southern women would often show an almost disconnect from the horrors of war, almost as a way of removing themselves or a means of removing themselves from the extremes that were happening around them. They were often attempting to carry on with their pampered way of life that was readily apparent prior to the onset of the American Civil War. So these were very wealthy women. They had no idea about struggle, and they were still doing what they could to maintain that class system. A famous woman for that, and I'm not sure if is anyone here familiar with Mary Chestnut's writings? She is the quintessential historians. We rely on her writing because there was very little that was known about what was going on in the South and how women were being perceived until Mary Chestnut, a very wealthy woman, her husband was a politician in South Carolina. She writes this diary, and she has it, published very shortly after the Civil War, and people are now seeing exactly that persona, that almost disconnect that happens with the Southern women at this time. So Mary Chestnut would become one of the most respected inside views of Southern society during wartime. If you guys ever get a chance to read her stuff, you read it. It is really, it kind of sucks you in, and as you see how she perceives what's going on as the war is going on around her. Her astute observations focus not only on the upper class, but also the social classes found within the Confederacy. While war raged around her, she would still focus on this glee and delight of seeing her boys in gray as they marched through the city of Charleston, South Carolina. In her eyes, war was the delight of the South, which unfortunately caused a great disruption to her social life and that of her friends. She would go on to say her only regard she had for Washington, D.C. was the certainty that the Southern women and her kinfolk would no longer be among the highly praised society that she once enjoyed so much while she was in the capital. Other wealthy women would follow suit of Mrs. Chestnut, and they would document their stories and their time during the Civil War, often filling their private diaries with the woes of the war, not so much of the bloodshed, but of the disruption of their social life. That seems to be the general theme that you see going on and on and on with it. Early on during the war, many Southerners, especially the women, saw that the war was a gallant affair for their brave men to take down those damn Yankees. And they wrote that quite a bit. Quite a bit. So a little entry from Mary Chestnut, just to kind of give you a little bit of perspective of how she wrote and what she saw out her window when she was writing some of her little diary entries and her letters. She wrote, how grateful, this is about 1860, how grateful we were for this pious exclamation, we mean business this time. Because of this convocation of the notables, this convention, in it are all our wisest and best. They really have tried to send the ablest men. The good men and true South Carolina was never more splendidly represented. And she's talking about these soldiers that are walking through town at this time. Patriotism aside, it makes society delightful. One need not regret having ever left Washington. So she felt, even though she had to leave Washington, she still could have a good society with the upper crust because her soldiers and also all of that upper crust, the politicians that were in D.C., now have kind of made their own little group in the South, so they were still able to keep their social life. Mary Chestnut's diary was a reflection of what she called the splendor of the Southern men and boys as they filled the city of Charleston, pushing for the start of the war. She had removed herself from the Union capital of D.C. as the war approached. She saw that war at that moment for the South was to raise up against what she considered the Northern aggression, and she writes about that continuously. Her one regret was the fact that she would be removed, as I said earlier, from that high society, the elite of the whites, and she often refers to that quite a bit in her writing, that filled that political arena, especially for those in the South. So she really wanted to maintain that elite white social structure that she found. She removed it from D.C. and just brought it with her down south. So through the eyes of these Southern ladies, Amanda T. Edmonds, she writes in around 1861 that upwards of 15,000 men are stationed in and around Harper's Ferry, have been coming in from extreme southern states by hundreds. Brave, gallant men who we hear anxious to fight, gallant soldiers to our soil, our own dear Virginia, destined to be the battleground. And if you read any longer in this, she was extremely proud of the fact that these men were marching through and that they were showing their face or showing their force in Virginia. She felt that it was going to be a grand scale to watch these men push the Yankees aside. Also, we'll see from historian Jeffrey Wirt, he wrote the extensive writing of Mosby's Rangers. He put in there that Southern women saw war with the eyes of romance, strolls under the moonlit sky with dashing, handsome warriors, eligible, youthful men who would risk their lives for the cause, fostering the inevitable courtship and flirtations. And they still did this up until 2 and 3 years into the war. They felt it was their chance to find a new man in their life or to socialize with other people. So we're going to talk a little bit with these rebels with the cause. These are my genteel ladies, my Confederate spies. Women who chose the endeavor of spying for the South would alter the persona of the Southern belle, utilizing what God gave them as a means of military and political intrigue. Their work, though brief, was highly regarded from military commanders and Confederate political leaders. Because of the dichotomy found within social dynamics of the period, those women who were from the higher echelon of society were in a position to aid the Confederacy simply because of their access to high social events. These women, these Southern belles as we know them, had established places in society through the wealth and prestige of their families. It was because of their prominence in society that made them highly effective in maneuvering throughout the Southern and even some Northern upper class. If one needed to gain information from a military or political top aide, that individual would be completely comfortable in associating with what they considered a mere woman. Because what could a woman do? What would she talk about? Men, women openly talked. Again, North and South did not matter. No matter that these were mere women, these women, people would even talk to them even though they knew that they were diehard Confederate supporters. So these Southern women knew the importance of their place in society and were willing to use their connections to gain important information for the Southern cause. Feminine wiles, flirtation, illicit affairs, and there were many, espionage, lying, and secreting of documents were completely acceptable means of espionage if it was for the greater good of a Southern victory. So here you are seeing women who didn't even turn a page of a story or turn the page of their music unless they had someone do it for them, and now you're seeing women within a matter of a year jumping into, now they're going to go and start crossing enemy lines, and now they're going to go start being talking to their union counterparts or their union people that are focusing and walking around to gain information and pass that information on to their Southern counterparts, or their Southern handlers as they call them. So now we're going to take a look at some of these most notable female Southern spies. Rose O'Neal Greenhow, her story I just fell in love with her story because she was so, she had her daughter involved. Her little 9-year-old daughter got involved with it. Laura Ratcliffe, Antonia Ford, and Belle Boyd broke all societal barriers, no matter the cost, just to see the Confederacy win the war. So has anyone here, have any of you guys heard of any of those Southern women, those female spies? You have? Which one did you hear?
The only one I wasn't really familiar with was Ratcliffe.
Laura Ratcliffe. Laura Ratcliffe and Antonia Ford were cousins.
Oh.
Yeah. So we're going to look at Rose Greenhow a little bit. Do I have that? Okay. So Rose was a noted beauty, a socialite that was often referred to as the Grand Dame of Washington society. She was the widow, this is the little catch to it. She was the widow of a former federal Army officer who had passed away while they were stationed in California. Rose used her connections from her husband's former position to move throughout Washington, D.C. society and collect information from those who would talk to her. And frankly, everyone talked to Rose O'Neal Greenhow. She had a presence about her that people just automatically started spilling the beans when they were around her. They did not stop, even though they knew she was very adamant about being a Southern supporter, they still had no problem talking to her. Confederate, Yankee, politician to shopkeeper, no one held their words when they were around her because once again, after all, she was a mere woman. What could she do, right? She actually started basically changed the course of the war from the very first battle. So she was adamant in her praise for the South and the need to remove, she would often say, those uppity Yankees. Rose had no problem with spying for the Confederacy, even as she was collecting a widow's pension from the federal government. So she was spying on the federal government, but still receiving a federal pension from her husband, from the federal government. Talk about double dipping. She had no qualms about it. She had no problem spying within that DC society. She was freely allowed to move around these federal and union government functions. Society praised her ability to command a room or a conversation with her wit, her beauty, and charm. She had what people would say extremely seductive powers. And levels of persuasion combined with her open support of the Southern cause made her the ideal candidate for espionage. She was literally recruited by the governor of Virginia because he knew that she had connections in DC. He knew that people openly talked to her and that she was well received. And he went to her and said, "Would you start collecting information for us?" And she was like, "Yeah, of course." And she did. And she brought her daughter in with it too. At one point it was asked, "What are you willing to give?" And that is, the governor asked Rose this, "What are you willing to give?" And she said, "Sir, absolutely anything." Rose openly formed illicit relationships with Union troops and Northern sympathizers to obtain information regarding Yankee troop movement, government information, and the status of the Army supplies and their reinforcements. She had extreme attention to detail, which allowed her to acquire imperative information regarding troop movement, location prior to that first Battle of Bull Run. So June 1861, Union troops were set up to stop Southern troops making their way up into DC. And they were going to meet at their headquarters, or that group was going to meet in Manassas. Rose communicated to Southern commanders the movement of Union troops that were headed into Manassas, dispatching messengers to P.T. Beauregard, General Lee, and then the President Davis for the Confederacy. She informed the Southern commanders of the North's intent to block transportation lines. Because of her quick thinking and valuable information, Southern troop reinforcement were able to reach Manassas, Virginia, and halt Northern movement into the South at the first battle of the war. Her information allowed the Confederate Army to win the battle and push Northern forces back to D.C. Robert E. Lee and President Davis would later go on to state it was because of her information that Rose collected that she, quote, saved the day for the Confederacy and for the South. Many would later remark that that first battle of Bull Run was either, now it depends on which side you're looking at, the winning side or the losing side. So the battle was either won or lost on the loose lips of a woman. But I always like to say, so who was talking to that woman? There's a little chain of command that was going on there. Rose didn't just make it up. So men were talking to Rose. Rose just kept going and just furthered that little pass on the information. So it was Northern men, it was their wives that were openly talking to Rose, knowing that Rose was a Southern supporter. So Rose O'Neal would go on to carry this momentum throughout her time as a spy, up until she at one time had her own spy ring, 48 women, 2 men, her own daughter, and 2 former slaves actually ended up helping. Why? I've never figured that one out, why they ended up helping her. Maybe that was just, she was just so engaging. I couldn't figure that one out. They would all support Rose in this spy ring. So even though she was imprisoned, multiple times she was imprisoned under house arrest, and then they put her in Capitol Prison with her daughter, she still was able to collect information while she was in prison, and she still passed it along. Her information was then passed along throughout the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis warmly received her once that she was considered removed completely from D.C. and then sent to the South. Many in Washington speculated that Rose eventually was seducing federal officials in return for military intelligence. That speculation has never been affirmed or proven completely, but there's a lot of documentation showing that she had illicit relations with men just to get the information from them, and had multiple ones in her home. So up until the day she passed in October of 1864, Rose was willing to give her all to the South. Just to tell you how she was willing to just die for the Confederacy, she did. While trying to escape a Union blockade, naval blockade, and trapped in a sinking lifeboat, Rose drowned, laden with Confederate gold that she had acquired for the Confederate cause. She had the gold stuffed in the pockets of her dress. She was coming back from overseas. She had gained some support over there and started collecting money. She was trying to get back into South Carolina. The Union blockade got her. She jumped off and with a couple of men into this rowboat, refused as the rowboat, rough seas, it's starting to tip. She's not going to give up because she's got all this money in her dress. She goes overboard and she drowns, refusing to give up that gold. They later found out, when they found her body, they did find the gold. The Confederate did end up getting that gold as they plucked it off her dead body. Rose drowned, like I said, she was laden with this, was filling her pockets, and she literally gave her life in the complete devotion of the Southern cause. And it was because of that, she was buried with full military honors and became a revered symbol throughout the Southern cause, or the Confederate cause, and she became the legacy of female espionage. So she dies in, I said, 1864. She was only 50 years old, just shy of 50 years old when she passed away. So I was talking earlier about the cousins. I call it keeping it in the family. They were cousins, they were spies, they were two renowned beauties in the Northern Virginia area. So you have Laura Ratcliffe and her cousin Antonia Ford. They would use their family connections and charm to aid the Confederacy, eventually being credited with saving the lives of Confederate Brigadier General Jeb Stuart and Colonel John Singleton Mosby. Both young ladies were completely devoted to the Southern cause and were willing to step outside those societal expectations of the day to gain invaluable information from the Union troops. Through the manipulation of their family status in the community and with the ease of conversation and attentiveness, both girls became invaluable to the Confederacy. You guys see the pattern? If these women were very easy to talk to, people just spilled the beans. And they had no problem, because once again, they're continuously thinking, what can a woman do? Military commanders, Stuart and Mosby, were regular visitors to the prosperous home of Antonia Ford's family and openly sought the company of Antonia and her cousin, Laura. General Stuart, and this is where there's a little kind of scandal, and some of it is proven, some of it's kind of speculation. So General Stuart, though a married man, was completely dazzled by the beauty of Laura Ratcliffe and often wrote of his admiration and high regard for the young woman. He even presented her gifts throughout their association. We even came across love letters between the two of them, where he was supposed to secret away and spend the Christmas with her, but he had to be out on the field when his field was he had to go back home to his wife and kids. So General Stuart, he would go on to introduce Laura Ratcliffe to Colonel Mosby, who sought her out to help with gathering of intelligence from the Union forces. So just to tell you how engaging Laura Ratcliffe was, not only did she have this very prominent commander, Jeb Stuart, she now has John Mosby, who's now becoming completely enthralled and indebted to her. Jeb Stuart would later go on and gift Laura a leather-bound, it was like a leather-bound book, his watch chain. He had a couple of love letters and handwritten poems in there that he gave her, and that kind of shows that connection that he had with her. This caused, like I said, many today's historians to pretty much question how close of a relationship did Laura have with Jeb Stuart. Laura goes on to express her desire to Colonel Mosby of wanting to be able to support the Southern cause, no matter what she had to do. So she was even going so far as to plan a secret location, and if you're familiar with Northern Virginia, there literally is a mile marker on the side of the road from, they call it Laura Ratcliffe Rock. And this is where she would secret away documents when she knew that something was happening, and she would get messages to Colonel Mosby and say, meet me at the rock. And there is a mile marker because of her. And she's very revered up in Northern Virginia for historians. So, like I was saying, she would have this hide or secret her messages away beneath this rock, where she would leave valuable information regarding troop movement for the colonel to later on to retrieve. Author and historian Donald Winkler would go on to note, when she acquired secrets from the Union forces, she communicated them to Mosby either in person, under the rock, or concealed in a false bottom egg basket. She had free movement through enemy lines because, once again, she's a woman. Who's going to bother with her? Laura was not above using her beauty and her charm to fascinate the Union troops that would stop by her family farm for a rest or for supplies. Laura would also serve as a banker of Mosby's Rangers. She held and basically held his money and put his money and sent his money off to certain supply chains with it. She was also credited with saving Mosby's life on more than 2 occasions. So unlike her cousin, Antonia Ford utilizes her beauty and her wit to ensnare and beguile Union troops to obtain valuable information to pass along to Southern commanders. Many of the enemy troops and political leaders overlooked her blatant support of the Confederacy because of her uncommon beauty. Boastful men engaged in open conversations that involved Union troop movement and supply reinforcements, which Antonia would later go on to pass along to her superiors or her Confederate handlers. She was also known to be when she was in her parents' boarding house. She had a secret compartment that she would listen to what the Union soldiers were saying down below. And if she wanted to get more information, she would ask them to come up to her room. What she did, we don't speculate. But she came up with a lot of information that later would be passed along. Boastful men engaged in open conversations about the movements, supply reinforcements, like I said. So Antonio carried on this unorthodox relations with prominent military men, North and South. One relationship Antonio had was with Union General Edward Stanton, who would become a supreme example of deception, as it allowed for then Southern Colonel Mosby to capture the Union general, in the middle of the night, virtually no opposition from the northern side, because Antonia had gotten information about where he was sleeping and what time he went to bed, and knew that no one was guarding him. So Mosby literally walked right into the man's room, got him, and took him in across as a prisoner of war. She was sneaky. So we have the downfall of the cousins. So what happened to these cousins? Ironically, later in life, impoverished by war, Laura Ratcliffe would marry her neighbor, believe it or not, a Union war hero, Milton Hanna, and lived a very respectable life. She was never captured nor imprisoned for her escapades in the Confederate espionage, and she dies a relatively very quiet life in 1923. It's why most people don't really know about her. And she's buried in, like I said, Herndon, Virginia. That is where she's literally held with extreme revere. And she does have those mile markers dedicated to her legacy. Unlike Laura, Antonia Ford would eventually be captured by Union forces for her connection to the capture of the Union General Stanton. Yet even that would not put an end to her spying exploits. Antonia Ford's ability to enchant the men she encountered extended to her time in Capitol Prison. And I love this story because it's so far-fetched. Antonio so completely enraptured her Union Provost Marshal, which was Joseph Willard. So she had a gentleman that was guarding her. A Union commander was guarding her. He was in charge of the Capitol Prison. She enchants him so much so that he later goes on and marries her. So she marries him in 1864. But the only reason why he agreed to do it was she had to take an oath of allegiance to the Union. She did. And she had that allowed for her subsequent release out of the federal prison. She died. She was very, very young when she passes away. She was in her early 30s. She spent only a very brief time as a spy, probably about a year, or a little bit more. And she's noted as one of the most significant spies or Confederate in the Confederate military records. And she passes away in 1871. So I'm sure a lot of you heard about Belle Boyd. She seems to be like the topic that everybody kind of perseverates on when they hear about spies. Belle Boyd has the one thing that the other three ladies didn't. She was not a very attractive woman. All the other women, she was actually noted as being very manly, kind of, even her mannerisms were very manly and kind of over the top. One even had described her as having a horse face, which I think is a little extreme. All the other women were very beautiful, very intelligent. Belle Boyd, they said, even though she was not attractive, she commanded a room the minute that she walked into it. So her name was Maria Isabella Belle Boyd. She was considered the Cleopatra of the succession. She had a ton of nicknames. She was regarded as, quote unquote, the fastest girl on horseback in Virginia due to her ability, her riding ability. And she was also, for what? Come on, people. And the Union Press nicknamed her La Belle Rebelle. They even had a nickname for her because of her extreme devotion to the South and the Confederacy. So her story starts very young in life. Prior to the Civil War, at the very young age of 17 years old, she shoots and kills a young Yankee soldier as she proves that he was invading her home. How she proved that he had nefarious means against her, is how she put it. Her later trial would end in her acquittal for justifiable homicide, and thus it began her work as a spy. Belle used flirtation and female manipulations to gain the confidence of men she came in contact with. What was highly unusual in Belle's case, like I was saying, she was not deemed graceful. She was not deemed attractive. It was the way of her walk, the way with men in uniform, through simply a look, a glance, or a smile that would convince these men to do pretty much absolutely anything for her. And Union and Southern men would go on to say they would do anything for her. So she had some kind of engaging atmosphere surrounding her, aura around her. Belle would command a room simply by her presence. Men would write of her ability to make those that she spoke to or engaged with to feel as though they were the only person in the room. She was often referred to, like I was saying, dour-faced, long-nosed, yet carrying an imposing figure and a presence that everyone wanted to be around. Confederate General Stonewall Jackson often remarked on her importance of intelligence gathering. From her position in the family's hotel in Front Royal, Virginia, she was able to gather information from Yankee boarders regarding the state of the Union Army, their movements, and supply reinforcements. She was another one that snuck upstairs and would listen to the Union boarders talk, and she would start writing stuff down. Her ability to eavesdrop and document her information aided the Confederate cause on multiple occasions. All her spying and eavesdropping was done while she was still socializing and entertaining the Yankee military men she encountered. She was so freely allowed and broke all the barriers of what any Southern woman, actually what any Northern woman would do. She went out in public alone. Women did not do this. You had to have a male person, either a male family member, husband, father, brother, whatever. You did not go out and socialize. You did not walk the streets without having that male companion with you. Or as you went older, you had a female companion or a matriarch that stayed with you. Just to show how she broke that barrier, Belle would be allowed to go into the tents of the Union commanders and the soldiers, as well as the Confederate ones and the officers. All the while, she was manipulating the enemy to gain information to pass along to the Confederate handlers. Because of her social station in Virginia, Belle freely walked the streets, unchaperoned, danced and flirted with her Federal and Confederate soldiers, and visited many military camps, North and South. There's multiple stories, and she ends up writing her diary while she's in prison at one time and publishes it, and she talks about how she freely crosses over enemy lines on a regular basis to go and hang out in the camps. What she was doing in the camps, we'll let you all speculate on that one. Even though with the Union soldiers, no one questioned her being there, ever. Though captured multiple times, and she was captured multiple times, upon each release, she would immediately return to her life of espionage. She would even use her time in prison to spy on fellow inmates and gain information on the true Southern sympathizers. And she would pass that on to her handlers, and then they would move it out. So she was spying on people that she was in prison with. Her open nature allowed her to befriend Union troops while openly manipulating them into helping her cross picket lines, transporting vital documents to Southern commanders. All this was done under the nose of the federal government and the Union military. No one questioned what she was doing. So how did her legacy end? She was a spy for a very relatively brief time, only a few short years. She was invaluable to the Confederate cause. Towards the end of the war, she would face a seizure of her ship by Union forces. Nonetheless, she would still be able to captivate her captor. Once again, we have another one, a Union naval officer, Samuel Heritage. He would fall under Belle's spell, eventually marrying her and proclaiming his intent to change from Union to Southern, just because he wanted to be with her. She was intriguing, beguiling, and obviously very savvy. Belle would later write her memoirs as well as take her story to the stage. She did become a stage actress, and she would go up there at this period after the war. She would go up on stage and talk about her life of being a Confederate spy and her time in prison. Today, she's recognized as one of the leading figures in female espionage, both North and South, of the American Civil War. She passes away in Wisconsin at about 1900. So when we see that transformation of the Southern Belle, it's a decidedly male role of rebuilding of communities that would fall to the Southern women who survived the war. War brought significant change to the social dynamics of what was once a very regimented Southern society. Women would not only work in their home and on their land, they would start to work outside the home as the decimation of war forced them away from the life that they would always known. These Southern belles were no longer the pampered ladies of the drawing room who'd spent their days at leisure or attending balls and social events. Economic emancipation, social advancement, and political acceptance would become the new foundation within the female Southern class system. Southern women would face the massive social upheaval associated with the aftermath of war, rebuilding both the antebellum social order as well as its physical environment. Yet preservation of that Southern culture would still be a prominent factor among Southern women. With the patriotism of the Southern cause, even after the war, these women would face a new, what was considered a sexual awareness or a heightened sexual awareness, as well as a new definitive place within their community. During the war, women of all ages and social classes were forced to confront inflation, desperate mobs, starvations, the cruel effects of the marauding military forces, burning of crops, homes, churches, and school. Women of the South transformed not out of want or out of desire, but frankly, out of necessity. They had no choice. They had to do this. So you have your new Southern lady that now emerges. Gender dynamics of the antebellum South would move well beyond just the writing of letters of support and gathering of supplies, providing monetary aid or acting as a nursemaid or homemaker. Your Southern women, these new, what we consider the new Southern women, saw a transformation in the expectations of their gender, as well as the recognition of what they were willing to do for a Confederate victory. Many families who were split from the war, with one side supporting the South and one on the North, would question, well, who suffered the most? And you see a lot of letters, especially from the women, that would write to their Northern counterpart or their Southern counterpart, and it was almost like an argument in these letters as, well, who do you think suffered the most? A good example of that is the letters that are from this very wealthy Southerner called Sarah Payne Miller. And she has a cousin up in the North, and she writes to her cousin as the war is starting to dwindle down, and she really is questioning, like, why are you not giving me more sympathy? She states at one letter, I often wonder if Cousin Mary felt any sympathy for us way down south, or if she, like many others, thought that we were sinners. She also goes on to write, society has changed drastically because of the war. Deprived of the property and left without money because of the heavy taxes, facing loss of servants, now surrounded by the insolent sets of persons, and she called them carpetbaggers. That would be the Union people that came down and took over the land, as she liked to say. So the final outcome for the Southern Belle, the American Civil War gave the once elite Southern Belle the ability to transform their social dynamics while manipulating the misguided expectations of their gender. Sex appeal and female persuasion would be redefined by those who engaged in espionage, becoming the foundation for really covert military and political operations. There is much speculation on what exactly would have become or the outcome of certain military operations, if not for the involvement of these Southern women who were willing to take up spying as a form of support for their cause. So during the war, their overt devotion to the Confederacy was often overlooked by the Union, because as I said earlier, it's because they were women. No one believed that they could do any harm. After all, these were just mere women. How much harm could they do? This statement would be proven wrong time and time again throughout the war, as Southern forces were able to either win the battle or outmaneuver their Northern counterparts simply due to the information that was attained by these women, who risked all to spy for the Confederacy. The New South would see women as dominating forces within their family unit. These Southern ladies of genteel and delicate characteristics altered into what was considered clandestine military operatives and formative family matriarchs. You now see that shift of now women are becoming very powerful in the South. Family dynamics and class structures would see a transformation as the New South adjusted to post-war rebuilding and altered expectations. And we ask again, did the war alter the women, or did the women alter the war? And that really depends on what battle you're looking at, or how you're really kind of dissecting the war itself. There is, Rose O'Neal does, she literally, she did. And she wrote this in her memoir. And she has other letters that she goes on in graphic detail of what she's willing to do. But she had said at one time, God gave me both a brain and a body, and I shall use them both. She had no problem doing that. So, and also if you look at Belle, you look at Belle Boyd, she was considered a Southerner no matter what. And she said that if it is a crime to love the South, its cause and its president, then I am a criminal. I would rather lie down in this prison and die than leave it owing allegiance to a government such as yours. And she was saying this in reflection of someone had asked her about if she would change over and start to support the Yankees, as she put it. So I'm finished up, but what I did was I listed some fantastic books for you. Some of them are books, some of them are access points of like diaries, letters, but I also have some that I printed out if anyone wants those. They are fantastic reads. They do not read like a textbook at all. And if anyone has any questions at all, please feel free. We good? Anyone? And I am done for the day. Thanks.